Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for coming to this, my third lecture as Gresham Professor of Rhetoric. As you know, all these lectures are available as podcasts on the Gresham website, and I think there was some concern when Gresham made the decision to record their lectures so that you could watch them remotely. There was some concern that people wouldn't bother to come to these lectures. And I think it's great that although we live in a more and more virtual world, some of us are still very much committed to real life events and the social life and opportunity for discussion and exchange, which is part of that. So thank you for coming, and particularly on a rather wet, miserable evening. So this is my third lecture on reading. My first one simply asked, what is reading? My second one explored reading for pleasure. And they were to some extent theoretical and threw up various sort of abstract questions. Tonight's lecture, and the one that I'll be giving in about a month's time, are more historical. But that said, I do want to draw on some more theoretical dimension, so it won't all be history. So why have I called it ancient reading in historical context and not just ancient reading? Ancient reading is itself a really fascinating subject in my view. I've entitled it in historical context because I think what really fascinates me is to do with differences when it comes to reading. So is the way they read in the ancient world different from the way we read? We know what they read because we've got material evidence, but how did they read? How did they engage with writing and earlier with other kinds of marks and symbols and so on? So it's different that I want to look at, as well as exploring early writing, ancient writing. But before coming to the ancient world, I'd like to go back even earlier and consider some ancient artifacts, man-made artifacts, which have markings or other things that were clearly read by primitive man. So the question is, how were they read? And one way into making sense of this is to consider the discipline of... sorry, I've just lost my way. So I really want to look at the differences in semiotics between three different categories. But I'll come to that in a moment. So the three artifacts that I'd like to look at is the Ischenko Bone, which is a baboon bone that was found in Africa, and a painting from Lascaux, famous caves in southwest France, and a knippus, which I'll come to in a moment. Now, if these very early artifacts, and I'll be showing some images of those, were decoded, then how can the modern discipline of semiotics, which is basically the science of signs, how can this science of signs help us understand how early man made sense of these artifacts? Now, the discipline of semiotics was first proposed by John Locke in his essay on human understanding in the 17th century. And he said there are three kinds of human knowledge. There's physics, there's ethics, and there's semiotics. Semiotics, the science of signs, which is what we'll be looking at. And semiotics is generally divided into three categories. There are three kinds of signs that semiotics concerns itself with. So there's the idea of the symbol, and that's a sign that has no resemblance to what it represents. Then we have an icon, which is a sign that does show some resemblance to what it represents. And then we have an index, which is a sign that's directly connected to what it represents. And I think these three aspects of semiotics, the science of signs, are useful to us when we look at these very early artifacts. So I'll just do a quick test now. So there at the top you have the key, symbol, icon, and index. So number one, Facebook. So the question we ask ourselves is, what sort of relationship does it have? Well, the Facebook is clearly a symbol because it doesn't have any actual resemblance to what it represents. In that sense, it's convention. We now know when we see that blue F sign that it refers to Facebook. Now, the tree is an icon because it's not a real tree, but it's tree-like enough, rather like a child's drawing perhaps of a tree. So there's some resemblance, so that would be an icon. The lips, on the other hand, would be an index because it's directly connected with what it represents. A woman with lipstick on has kissed the piece of paper, and there is the imprint. Recycling, of course, is a symbol because, again, the idea of recycling glass, tin, whatever it might be, isn't in any sense represented by this green diagram, but we now have come to understand that that is our conventional way of representing recycling. Then there's a scan of a fetus, which is also an icon. Doesn't have a direct resemblance with the fetus, but it does bear some resemblance. So 6 and 7 are clearly indexes because one is a photograph of Michelangelo's statue of David. That's actually it. And the other is Van Gogh's famous sunflowers. So we've got these three different ways of decoding signs, three different relationships between signs and how we understand them. So now what I want to do is to try and connect this with these early artifacts and see how we might decode them. The earliest kind of reading was of notches. And what we need to determine is, what are they semiotically? How do we understand these notches and begin to try to understand how early man read those notches? Now, I want to begin with the Ischenko Bone, and here it is. I hope you can see the notches in it. Can you? Now, it's actually 10 centimetres long, so I've sacrificed one of my pencils because I think it's quite important to be quite clear about the scale. So it's a baboon fibula. So it's a very ancient baboon bone, only this big, and it has 3 sets of notches on it that run down 3 different sides. And I hope you can see the notches. I mean, you can't see the groups that they're in, but I have an illustration to try to make that clearer. Now, one of the great things about this bone is that it says something wonderful about us as humans, I think, that so many theories have been proposed as to what these notches might represent. So it does seem to me to show extraordinary sort of human imagination and ingenuity that you can take an ancient bit of a baboon bone that has a few markings on it and come up with this extraordinary range of theories as to what the notches actually mean. And I want to run through some of those. Now, I think amongst the most convincing theories about how these notches might be read are the mathematical ones. And one school of thought says that there are certain sort of patterns in the notches that correspond with certain number systems, certain ideas in the number system. And they work like this. Oh, no, sorry, that's just to show you where it was found. So it was found in the 1960s in what was the Belgian Congo. That's where it originates. And I've picked these 3 artifacts because they're from completely different parts of the world. So Lascaux in southwest France, what was the Belgian Congo for the bone, and then the quipus is from South America. So here are the markings. So if you magnify it up, because as I say, it's only actually this big, then you see that there are groups of notches with gaps. So this 11, for example, on the right-hand side, there are 11 notches there, and then a gap before the grouping of 13, and so on. So one theory is that you can, once you've decided on exactly how many notches there are in each group, you begin to see some basic patterns. This bone, by the way, originally it was estimated to be round about 9,000 BC. That's how old the actual bone is. There have been more extravagant claims that it could be up to 22,000 years old. So it's a very, very old bit of baboon bone. And if anyone happens to be going to Brussels, it's actually in the National Museum in Brussels, or the Royal Belgian Institute of Natural Sciences, I should say, in Brussels. So how do we make sense, then, of the number sequences? Well, the middle one begins with 3 notches. So this is, on the left-hand side, you see the 3 up at the top there, that's what I mean. So 3, and then it doubles to 6. Then you go down a bit further, you've got 4, which double to 8. And then it seems to move from being multiplied by 2 to being divided by 2. 4 is multiplied up to 8, but then you've got 10 halved is 5. So those ones seem to show some understanding of multiplication and division. But you can go further than that, and you can say, look, we've got odd numbers here too. We've got 9, 11, 13, 17, 19, and 21. Starting at the bottom here, 9, there's an 11, there's a 13, there's 17. So that's the right-hand image. Then you've also got 10 and 20. So that's the prime numbers. So wait a minute, I think I've slightly lost myself here. So we've got the prime numbers between 10 and 20. So we've got 9, 11, 13, 17, and 19 would all be prime numbers. Sorry? I beg your pardon. Thanks. Just making sure you're all wide awake. And then you've got this possibility of some subtraction, because you've got 10 plus 1 would be 11, 10 minus 1 would be 9, 20 plus 1 would be 21, and 20 minus 9 would be 19. So all those number patterns are there. There's no question, by the way, that these markings were made by man. I mean, no archaeologist has suggested that they might have been the result of some storm and just markings that were made by them being tumbled in the wind or whatever. There's complete consensus that they are actually man-made. So do we buy it? Do we buy that this is actually a very early system for doing basic multiplication and basic division, and that very primitive man would have looked at the bone to help with these basic bits of arithmetic? Well, it's a difficult question, and there's a very wonderful book called How Mathematics Happened the First 50,000 Years. It's a great title. I assume we have to wait another 50,000 years for volume 2. But in it, Peter Rudman argues that the concept of prime numbers could only be derived from the concept of division. So it's only once we've worked out how division works that we can work out what these peculiar prime numbers are. But he dates the discovery of division to about 10,000 BC and says that there isn't any evidence that prime numbers were understood until about 500 BC. So something's wrong. Either the dating of the bone is wrong or Rudman's wrong. And let's hope that more evidence emerges that will allow us to make sense of these very tricky questions about the very earliest kinds of reading. Now, in addition to claims that it's a mathematical record, that these marks have to be read as relating to maths, there have been some other explanations. One is that it's actually an astronomical text and relates to certain kinds of aspects of the lunar calendar. According to Alexander Marshak, he's worked out that the notches correspond to a kind of 6-month lunar calendar. Then, this is the way academics work, Judith Robinson said, no, Marshak has over-interpreted the evidence, and the notches are much, much more likely to relate to stages in a woman's menstrual cycle. Okay, well, it may be. And of course, this has led another researcher, Claudia Zaslavsky, to say, well, in that case, this tool must have been made by, you've guessed it, a woman. Now, of course, we don't have enough evidence, really, for any of this. I mean, as I say, I think the mathematical one is the most persuasive. But there are some more sort of deflating theories, and one is simply that the marks were made to give the implement some grip, that it was actually just so that there's a bit of friction there, which is a bit, as I said, it's a bit disappointing. And I think there's enough by way of groupings to say that that's probably not the explanation. Interestingly, if it's the case that these markings were just made so that the handle of a tool had some grip, then obviously there wouldn't be a semiotic meaning. In other words, they're not there to be read as something. They're there for ergonomic reasons so that you could hold the tool in a certain way. Interestingly, this is a bit of an aside, but there's some quite interesting work going on about tool making and primitive tool making that argues that it's actually like a language because you have to do things in a certain sequence, in a certain order, and that there is actually a kind of grammar of tool making. But as I say, that's something of an aside in terms of our concerns this evening. So what about other very early images? We can see this. We recognize that it's a horse. We know it's very, very old. Do we see it and understand it as it was seen and understood by primitive man? How do we go about answering that question? And what is it in semiotic terms? Is it a symbol? Is it an index? These are, just because we see it as a horse, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's how it was seen and read. It was understood by the people who made it. Psychophysicists have been doing some very interesting work in terms of how we see, really, a complex image like this. Obviously, we can't literally take the whole thing in as one snapshot. And by watching the way the eye scans images, psychophysicists have been able to build up a picture of how we actually take the image in. And the general consensus is, and this isn't just a still image, this would also be a street scene. If you come around the corner of a building and something's going on, then where does the eye go to try quickly to make sense of the scene before you? And the general consensus is that you go from big to small, so you see the big image first, and then you start to take in other smaller markings. Also that you start at the top and work your way down to the bottom. So the contention would be that you'd be more likely to have noticed those lines at the top before looking at the hooves. And you look sort of inside to outside. So, it doesn't work so well with this image, but if the horse was sort of off-centre, you'd probably have seen the horse first because it's largest, but then you start this inside to outside. And also that we scan from left to right. So some of this, no doubt, has an evolutionary explanation, that as when we were primitive beings and we came out of a forest, we might want to see prey. So how would we scan to see if there's any prey? And equally, how do we scan to make sure there's no predator? So the way we took in the landscape will have been according to a certain kind of ocular sequence. But of course, partly evolutionary, but no doubt partly conventional, because we read books from left to right in the West. Therefore, is it altogether odd if we scan paintings from left to right? And the question is, well, what about those societies where you read from right to left? Do they scan images? This particular image, by the way, is from Lascaux 2, the cave known as Lascaux 2. And it's one of the earliest images made by Homo sapiens. They used to be known as the Cro-Magnons. And it's probably about 18,000 years old. And from the early 20th century, which coincides with the origins of modern semiotics, people have tried to work out what this meant to those early peoples. Do these images have a kind of purpose? Do they have a meaning beyond themselves? Now, early on in the 20th century, people adopted the kind of 19th century art for art's sake. That was a movement in the 19th century that argued that what mattered was to represent things as they are for their own sake. There was no polemic, there was no argument, there was no trying to persuade people that art was there for itself, and why not just assume that these are representations that were made for themselves and they have no other meaning. We're not meant to read anything more into them. I quite like that idea of, we use the metaphor deeper meaning. Does this have a deeper meaning, some idea that sort of below the surface there is some other meaning? It's not just what you see. Well, one of the early and interesting ideas was that these images are associated with totemism. Totemism being a system of belief in which humans are said to have kinship or mysterious mystical relationships with corresponding spirit beings, which might be animals or plants. Now, the entity or totem is thought to interact with a given kin group or an individual and to serve as their emblem or symbol. Now, if you decided to read this totemically, you wouldn't simply see it as the representation of a horse, an icon in semiotic terms, but also a symbol for an individual group. The horse would relate to an individual, so it would be a symbol of that individual. Well, totemic readings don't seem to be taken very seriously by mainstream archaeologists. The most famous and eminent interpreter of cave paintings, and his theories held sway for a very long time, was Abbé Breuil, a Frenchman. His days are 1877 to 1961. He was a priest, he was an archaeologist, he was made professor at the Collège de France, and in 1952 he published 400 Years of Cave Art. And this was a groundbreaking study of 92 caves worldwide. And Abbé Breuil claimed, at least, that he'd calculated that he'd spent an entire 7 years underground in the course of his researches. Now, he thought that the way to understand cave painting, to read these images, was to see them as related to hunting practices, which were associated with masking practices. And he came up with this theory because there was a clear parallel with Aboriginals, the Arunta people in Central Australia. And so he claimed that the Paleolithic cave paintings, like those of the Arunta, were records of hunting practices that involved dressing up as the prey that you sought. And that the existence of these images of animals actually meant that had a magical effect, and it meant you were more likely to come across one. So the actual image kind of encouraged the real beasts in the world. Images of slaughtered prey were also supposed by some sort of magic to increase your chances hunting. So these are examples of what another 19th century anthropologist, James Fraser, called sympathetic magic. And I think it's familiar to us as sticking pins into a mannequin that represents somebody that you hate. That sticking the pins in a little doll is supposed actually to cause pain to the person it represents. Now, there have also been structuralist explanations of how we should read these images. And these mean leaving aside all our sort of ideas of primitive man and just looking at the evidence. So just looking at the markings and trying to establish what relationship there is between the different markings. So this, in semiotic terms, privileges syntactics, which is the part of semiotics to do with the relationship between images. Now, structuralist methodologies seem to have a kind of rigour to them. The irony is that the rigour hasn't actually led to any groundbreaking discoveries. And I think it's fair to say that in a sense, I think the way that archaeologists are looking at these paintings now is still really in a structuralist way. They document, they date, and so on. There's one other explanation, and this theory was proposed in the 1990s, which associated them with shamanism. Shamanism is another animalistic belief system in which there's a sort of mediation between the visible world and the spiritual world. And in shamanic religions, there's a notion that two or more multiple worlds coexist, and these worlds interact. And another belief is that some people are themselves the shamans who have this privileged relationship with other worlds and can intervene in those other worlds to help those of us who are not shamans. Well, we know that Homo sapiens descended into these extraordinary caves, and we know that anthropologically there's always been a very close association between ideas of underworld and mystery and other worlds associated with going deep into the Earth's surface. Whether that meant that certain people did go into these caves and hallucinated and then produced representations of their hallucinations, I mean, that seems to me to be far-fetched. Why bother? I mean, I think you can understand and buy into shamanism without there being these extraordinary number of very, very striking images. And after all, we have to remember that to produce these images was incredibly laborious. I mean, you had to make the paints out of plants and so on. You had to have enough fire to be able to see what you were doing deep down in the cave and keep it going. And in order to go and visit them, you had to take more fire down into the cave. There are some caves where the markings are so high on the walls that the only explanation as to how they got there is that either primitive scaffolding was made so that they could climb up high, or that there were extraordinary feats of sort of acrobatics, of people climbing on top of each other in order to make these markings. So it's a very interesting area, but I don't think we do yet know quite how to read these images, and in semiological terms, quite what they are. So what of other reading? This is an ancient civilization, Corral. This is probably the earliest urban settlement in the Americas. It's about 200 kilometers north of Lima, and it dates back about 4,600 years. Big, complex city. And the people who inhabited this city made these extraordinary artifacts. They're called quipus. The plural is quipu, Q-U. They're sometimes spelled K-H. And these are strings and knotted strings, and some of the strings are, unfortunately, you can't see the colour. They're very colourful. And the knots are made in different places on the strings. And a lot of work has been done on these, there are a fair number, and something very exciting has come about. Until recently, this was the kind of prevailing view of what the quipus was. It consists of a length of rope, so that's the one at the top, from which numerous other threads are suspended, some of them with their own subsidiary offshoots. The length of each thread, its colour, and the position of any knots in it can acquire specific meanings. At its simplest, this is an easy way of recording quantities of different goods, so a knot for each pig, for example. If a length or colour of thread is an agreed symbol of a given commodity, the knots, which might be registering units, tens or hundreds, will give a quick account of the total. So the quipus can also cope with more abstract themes. If threads or knots are allocated to, say, the role of days and months, then a timescale can be recorded. And this would therefore be a historical record of, say, the length of a king's reign since his accession. Now, what a quipus can't do, and this is what was long argued, is be a substitute for writing. It can record how long a king's reigned, but not what his name was. Writing can record the name, but how could this possibly record his name? It could provide a messenger with a mnemonic, with a technique to help memory retention, but the messenger still has to remember the message. Now, to illustrate this, I just want to talk about the Knuckle Mnemonic. I don't know how many people know the Knuckle Mnemonic, but this is for remembering how many days there are in different months. And someone realised, okay, well, if you put your fists together and take the first protruding knuckle as January, February, that's the dip, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December, then actually all the raised knuckles are the months that have 31 days in them. Now, so you can use that as a mnemonic. You can use that and read your knuckles to remember how many days there are in which month. But if you hadn't been told that in the first place, you couldn't just show someone your knuckles and expect them to read it as, oh, yes, that's how it works. The knuckles are the months with 31 days in it. So that's what I mean about a mnemonic. So this could have codes in it that would allow a messenger to read the code to remember the name of the king. But that's not the same as reading writing. Yeah, that's a different process. Now, in 2010, so relatively recently, an extraordinary book about these quipu was published by Cambridge University Press. And Dr. Galen Brokaw argues that the quipus is part of a semiotic system of making signs, which actually stands in for writing. And this was a very bold line to take, because traditionally the idea was that Andean peoples were non-literate. And there's long been this divide between the idea of a civilization that is literate and the idea of a civilization that is non-literate. One that is essentially an oral culture and the other that's a written culture. And that's overlaid by ideas of the primitive as opposed to the civilized. Yeah? Well, what he argues in this extraordinary book, and I've tried to kind of summarize it as clearly as I can, he begins with a kind of theoretical model that reconciles orality, that's the idea of the spoken culture, and literary studies with media studies being a sort of broader area of semiology and the reading of signs. And he does this because he thinks that this trenchant divide between orality and literacy is specious, just doesn't hold. And then he looks at how the society distributes semiotic functions, so the reading of signs, within various media, and tries to connect these with sort of economical and political systems. And he then looks at the whole history of the quipu from sort of pre-Columbian times through to the first 120 years or so of colonial rule in South America. And so what he's able to do is to take the records by the early colonizers, which are written records, and look at the kind of overlap between what priests and colonial administrators and so on recorded in writing, conventional writing, and how does that happen? Oh, how extraordinary. Did I touch this? So, in other words, he's been able to bring these two things together, the alphabetic European language records produced by the administrators and the priests and so on, and the indigenous peoples' records. And that's how he's been able to work out just how much information is actually recorded in this. And he's taken that to the point where he thinks there is a really good argument to say, actually, this idea that there are oral cultures and there are written cultures is far too simplistic. There are all manner of ways in which we can record the past. But there is a fundamental difference. I mean, as I mentioned, with the idea that this could be mnemonics, but the king's name can't be represented in these strings. And that's because we normally understand writing as a sequencing of standardized symbols, characters or signs, in order to produce a graphic representation of human speech. Okay? So what happened, and it took an awful long time for humans to realize this could be done, was that you have to have a conventional system of signs that actually connect with the sound. Yeah? So in this, there's absolutely no relationship between these knots and all the meaning that they hold, but it doesn't have any relationship with sound. But writing was a way of actually making graphic marks that stood in for human speech. And that was an extraordinarily groundbreaking moment. For a very long time, all we did was to say those five pebbles represent sheep, and that was the convention that we went by. But then suddenly, and it really was quite sudden, Sumerian scribes about 3,000 years ago developed systemic phoneticism. They started to coordinate signs and symbols, including pictograms, with speech. And so a writing system came into being, and this is where it came into being, in Sumer, which is this brown area, so you can see east of Egypt. And it then kind of spread out, and Akkadian, so the Akkadian Empire is the blue bit. Gradually that kind of took over. There was a period when a lot of people were bilingual, and they spoke both of these very difficult languages. But Akkadian won out, probably around 2000 BC. So what did they read, these first humans who could actually read the spoken language? Suddenly, emotions, names, stories, all manner of things could actually be written down and read in a way that's fundamentally different from quipus. So there's a surprising range. So we're talking about 2000 to 1000 BC is when these really much lengthier texts were produced. Hymns, lamentations, prayers to various gods, incantations, that was against certain sources of evil, love literature, wisdom literature that was made up of riddles and fables and proverbs and so on, some long epics, so in a sense the very origins of the novel, and of course myths. And there are about 550 texts still extant, and there's a wonderful website called SEAL, S-E-A-L, which you might want to visit, Sources of Early Akkadian Literature. And there you can see some of these extraordinary texts. That said, by and large, in the Akkadian Empire, most literature remained oral. Most of it was storytelling. And what was admired was the power of people's memories to remember these long stories that they performed orally, writing, and I think it's quite difficult for us to get our minds around this, wasn't actually seen as a sign of superiority. The sign of superiority was to have this amazing memory and to be able to tell stories and remember stories. But that wasn't the case in all early civilizations. In Egypt, for example, the literary culture was, once again, primarily oral, but the way the Egyptian empire was organized meant that you could rise in the administration if you were literate. So whereas in Akkadia, you were just a sort of craftsman if you were literate, you were just doing a job and not seen as having any sort of higher status. Within the Egyptian empire, if you were literate, the way the administration worked, you could rise. And so we've got a few letters that give us a sense of the importance of literacy in Egypt. So this was a bureaucrat, Duaketi, writing to his son, and he says, "Set your thoughts just on writing, for I have seen people saved by their labour. Behold, there is nothing greater than writings. They are like a boat on water. Let me teach you to love writing more than you love your mother. Let me encourage its beauty into your sight, for it is greater than any office. There is nothing like it on earth." And that's one of the very earliest recognitions of the value of literacy, which, as I say, in the ancient world was unusual. Well, of course, the extraordinary civilizations of this part of the world came to an end. And there are no extant records after about 640 BC. There are various theories about what happened. Some of them are ecological, some of them are to do with civil war. But in any case, written records stop. Now, fortunately, there were other civilizations in the ascendant in Greece and Rome. And here again, literacy wasn't really prized in the way that one might assume. Reading and writing was sort of potentially subversive because the text could kind of circulate. People couldn't control it. That if you were debating or speaking, you were there and your discourse was yours. You could be challenged. But once something was written down, there was a sort of anxiety about the way it might sort of circulate. Now, Plato, for example, we've got the written records, as it were, of his concerns. And in his Phaedrus, which is a sort of conversation between two people, between Socrates and Phaedrus, they're interacting with one another. And Plato has Phaedrus say, "Every word, once it is written, is bandied about, alike among those who understand it and those who have no interest in it, and it knows not to whom to speak or not to speak. When ill-treated or unjustly abused, words always need their father to help them, for it has no power to protect or help itself." So in other words, once something's written down, people are going to misread it. People are going to try and make out that it says something other than what the author might have said it meant. And so in many of these ancient civilizations, again, memory mattered, your ability to be persuasive orally, but the written was seen as a bit of a cheat, and it was also seen as quite dangerous. Because, as I say, it separated ideas from the person who would otherwise have had to defend them in oral debate. Now, one of the interesting differences between reading in the ancient world and the way we read was proposed a very long time ago, and until quite recently was assumed to be correct, and that was that the ancients always read aloud. This is associated with the idea that there's something dangerous about a written text circulating without its author. So the assumption was, no, in the ancient world, people read out loud and then debated and so on, and that silent reading came about much later. And the reason why there was this misunderstanding was largely because of St. Augustine. This is in the 4th century, but he's talking about the earlier period. And he describes his teacher's practice of silent reading, and that was the Bishop of Milan, St. Ambrose. Augustine wrote, "When he's reading, he drew his eyes along over the leaves, and his heart searched into its sense, but his voice and tongue were silent. Ofttimes when we were present, we still saw him reading to himself, and never otherwise. But with what intent soever he did it, that man certainly had a good meaning to it." Now, people took this and said, well, why was he so surprised to see him casting his eyes over the page, but not saying anything? And so this was assumed to mean that in the ancient world, people always read aloud, because this instance of St. Augustine, of his teacher reading silently made such a big impression on him. So for a very long time, people thought, okay, the big difference between reading in the ancient world and reading in the modern world has to do with whether it's aloud and you're sort of accountable in dialogue, or whether it's silent, private, and then there are questions of how subversive it might be, what ideas you might get, and all these sorts of things. Now, this presumption about this big difference between reading, one being out loud and one being silent, was well embedded in German history. Nietzsche wrote, quote, "The German does not read aloud, does not read for the ear, but merely with his eyes. He has put his ears in the drawer. In antiquity, when a man read, which he did very seldom, he read to himself in a loud voice. It was a matter of surprise if someone read quietly, and people secretly asked themselves why he did so. In a loud voice, that is to say, with all the crescendos, inflections, variations of tone, and changes of tempo in which the ancient public world took pleasure." And a lot of people assumed that libraries, for example, would have been fantastically noisy places, with everyone reading what they were reading out loud, and quite unlike a modern library. But what Nietzsche goes on to argue is that the greatest German prose was written for the pulpit. In other words, it was written to be read aloud, as in the ancient world, or so he assumed. So Luther's Bible, which he reckoned was the most important piece of writing, was meant to be read aloud in churches, and this ties in with what he understood of ancient reading. But actually there's ample evidence that lots of silent reading went on in the classical period. Euripides, in his tragedy, Hippolytus, the king, Theseus, confronted with the corpse of his wife, Phaedra, finds a letter fastened to her hand, and while the chorus is expressing its foreboding, Theseus silently reads the letter. In it, Phaedra falsely accuses Hippolytus of having raped her. His silent reading then contrasts with his emotional remonstrations, so he reads this letter silently, and then there's a great outburst. The letter, he says, and I quote, "shrieks, it howls horrors insufferable. A voice from the letter speaks." So that's a clear example of silent reading then being contrasted. Plutarch also has an interesting scene where it's clear that private reading is going on. So I think it's almost certainly the case that classicists have proved that this nice, tidy idea that the way we read in the ancient world was out loud and the way we read in the modern world is individually, secretly, silently, privately. And in fact, I'll just quote from Gavrilov, who's one of the classicists who's done a lot of work on this question. He concludes, "The phenomenon of reading itself is fundamentally the same in modern as in ancient culture. Cultural diversity does not exclude an underlying unity." So he's basically saying there's absolutely no argument that the way people read in the ancient world is any different from the way we read now. But I think the question is, just because the practice of reading may not have changed, in other words, the way we actually do it as an act, as an activity, just because that hasn't changed, does that mean that what we make of our reading hasn't changed? Surely not. And in a sense, there are two questions then. Well, there's the practice of reading, how you go about it, whether it's silent or whether it's out loud. But there's also, how do we engage with it? And is that the same as in the ancient world? And so I just want to finish by talking very briefly about Sappho. She's probably the most famous ancient woman poet. And these are some fragments from a Sappho poem. And so my question is, how was she read in the ancient world, and how has she been read since? Is it the same? So let's leave aside the question of whether it's aloud or silently, but actually engaging with this writing, what's happened? Well, she was born around 620 BC. She was very much praised by her contemporaries. Some thought she was the 10th muse. And she went on being widely read up until the Middle Ages. Strabo, who's a Greek Stoic scholar, he wrote, "In this whole span of recorded time, we know of no woman to challenge her as a poet, even in the slightest degree." And praise for her goes on. I mean, in the 15th century, Christine de Pizan, in her The Book of the City of Ladies, a very sort of early proto-feminist work, listed Sappho as one of the 18 proofs that women were as intellectually able as men. And in the early Renaissance, oh yes, that's Sappho on a vase, rather lovely images, allegedly with her lover. That's Raphael's Sappho, and this is a painting of Parnassus, and she's the only mortal included in the painting. Then if we skip to the Victorian period, there was a poll in the Pall Mall Gazette, and women were asked who the 12 most important women in history were, and one of them was Sappho. We don't have much Sappho. We only have very few fragments. And one of the things that's extraordinary about the way people have engaged with her poetry is that it's on the basis of so very little. And it has been read very differently. There is a female voice in her writing. In Fragment 16, for example, she says, "Some say an army of horsemen, some an army on foot, and some say a fleet of ships is the loveliest sight. But I say it is whatever you desire." So there she's suggesting that, men may like these symbols of war, these attributes of war, but not women. Helen of Troy is described by Sappho as desiring a man who was not her husband, and her passion is presented as more reasonable than that of a man's for fleets and ships. Alysus, on the other hand, simply said, "But through Helen the Trojans perished and all their city." So we see different attitudes to men and women in Sappho's poetry, in contrast to some of the male poets. Sappho kind of seduces us, I think, partly because there is so little to go on that we can sort of reinvent her from these fragments, almost fantasize about who she was. And certainly by the 19th century, there were plenty of detractors, plenty of really pretty vitriolic attitudes to her poetry. The French poet Baudelaire and the English poet Swinburne, they both described her as sadomasochistic and androgynous. I'm not quite sure how all that works. And also a femme fatale into the bargain. So I think what's interesting is that, okay, we know a lot about early man and what was recorded and how we might make sense of that. We know that the activity of reading, the practice of reading, was probably the same in the ancient world as it is now. But there's plenty of evidence that the way we've engaged with this different kind of writing has actually changed quite dramatically over time. And of course, once we get to the modern period, that extraordinary variety of engagement in the reading experience grows wider and wider. And it's that wonderful variety that I want us to explore in my next lecture. Thank you.